Good morning. Let's see, Paul's letter to the Ephesians, so Ephesians chapter 4, the rich young man, again. I feel like every time I give the homily, I'm talking about the rich young man. And St. Alypios. I want to tie these three together this morning with a fairy tale. Been reading fairy tales to my youngest daughter, and we came across one the other day called The Golden Bird. One of Grimm's fairy tales. But it goes something like this. Once upon a time, there was a king, and this king had an apple tree, and this apple tree bore golden apples. And as any king who had an apple tree that bore golden apples was wont to do, he would count those apples. And one day he realized that one of them was missing. So he sent one of his sons, his oldest son, out to go and watch the tree so he could find out what was happening. Well, this oldest son went out, and he stayed up for most of the night, but around midnight he fell asleep, and sure enough, in the morning, an apple was missing. So he sent out his second son. And of course, what happened? The second son fell asleep in the middle of the night, and another apple was missing. And so reluctantly, he sent out his youngest son. And he figured, the other two haven't done any better. Will this one be able to stay awake? But sure enough, this youngest son stayed awake. And what he saw was in the middle of the night, a golden bird lighted upon the tree and plucked one of those apples. Well, wanting to protect his father's treasure, he threw something at the bird. It didn't hurt the bird, but one single feather dropped down, a golden feather. And he took that to his father in the morning. And his father showed it to his kings and his advisors, and they said, "This bird is worth an entire kingdom." And so, of course, this king thought to himself, this should be mine. I should own this bird. So he sent his oldest son out again with a task to go and to find the golden bird. And as the son traveled, he came to a wood, and there he saw a fox. And he took aim with his gun, and the fox told him, wait, don't shoot. Don't shoot me. I can give you some advice. I know that you seek the golden bird. And on the path that you're traveling, you'll come to a village. And in that village, there will be two inns. One of them will be brightly lit. And there will be music and merriment coming forth from it. And the other one will be dark, and it will be quiet. And it will look rather poor to you. You should go and you should stay in the dark and quiet one. Well, the son thought nothing of the fox's advice, and in fact, tried to shoot the fox. But the fox escaped. But sure enough, as the son traveled along his way, he came to this village, and there he found these two inns. And he simply couldn't resist all of the merriment in the one inn, and he entered into it, and he forgot about the task that his father had given him. And so time went by, and the father figured, I must send my second son. And he sent him out. And what should happen? All of the same things. He met the fox. The fox gave him the advice. And he went to the inn, he went to the village, but he went to the wrong inn, and he too forgot about his task. And so, once again, the third son, reluctantly, was sent out. But when he came to the fox again said, don't shoot. I'll give you some good advice. And he said to the fox, Fox, you need not fear. You've given me good advice. I will do no harm to you. And in return for this, the fox said, well, hop on my back, and I'll take you swiftly to the village. So he went to the village, and he saw the two choices. But this youngest son decided to stay in the quiet inn, and there he enjoyed a good night's sleep. Nothing incredible happened. But in the morning, he went on his way, and the fox once again appeared to him and said, I know that you seek the golden bird. And you'll come to a castle if you keep traveling along this path, and there the golden bird is guarded by 100 men, but they're all sleeping. And if you work your way carefully through, you'll be able to take the bird, but you'll find it in an old, ugly wooden cage. Now, next to it, there's a beautiful golden cage, but don't put the bird in the golden cage, or else something bad will happen. So the young man did as he was told. He traveled, and sure enough, he found this kingdom and this castle. And there within the castle were 100 soldiers, but they were all asleep. And so he very carefully made his way, and he found the bird, and sure enough, there it was in this ugly wooden cage. And then he thought to himself, would it really be right to bring my father this golden bird in such an ugly cage? Surely a golden bird belongs in a golden cage. And of course, what did he do? He took the bird out, and as soon as he put it into the golden cage, it let out such a great shriek that everyone in the kingdom woke up, and he was arrested, and he was taken to the king. And the king said, "Your life is now forfeit, unless you can go find for me the golden horse that runs as swiftly as the wind." Now the story goes on, and I don't have time to tell the rest of it. But what fairy tales remind us over and over again is that things in this world are not often what they seem. They are often not what they seem. To come across to a fox, well, okay, we've all seen a fox maybe, but a fox that talks, well, that's different. To see this golden bird in a cage, but in an ugly cage. And as the story goes on, we find that brothers are not always the brothers that they may seem to be, and that people are not always what they seem. Well, this is the way that the world works, right? Fairy tales are telling us something that's deeply embedded in the world. And in fact, they're oftentimes giving us what I like to call gospel truth. It's the truth with which God made the world. That we look around and so often things are not exactly what they appear. But we forget this. And we need to be reminded. Now in our reading from Ephesians chapter 4, we get a few glimpses of something like this. Paul starts off and he says, "I, Paul, a prisoner for the Lord." I, Paul, a prisoner for the Lord. Now, it may not stand out to us very much, but here is Paul once again imprisoned for his faith in Jesus Christ. And what does he do? He writes letters. He writes letters to all of the churches that he knows about, to all of the churches that he has planted, and he writes to encourage his children in the faith. What's so unique about this? Well, what's so unique is that here is Paul in prison, and what would you do if you were in prison? What would you do if you were imprisoned unjustly? Perhaps you might be quick to complain, to cry, to be downcast, to think only of yourself. And yet what we see from the Apostle Paul is he does none of those things. In fact, when St. Luke records for us one of the many imprisonments of St. Paul, we find that St. Paul is rejoicing that he can be counted worthy of suffering for Jesus Christ. That St. Paul and St. Silas, they sing praises to God even as they are imprisoned. And so we have two perspectives here. From someone looking from the outside in, things are not what they seem. Here is this man who is imprisoned, and yet he sings. And yet he has joy. His outward circumstances aren't what determine his inner realities. You see, brothers and sisters, things are not always what they seem. And because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we can have joy in the midst of whatever situations we may face in this life. It's not always easy. We may have to work to do that. But nevertheless, that is the reality that we live in. Because this present life, our present circumstances, they do not define our eternal existence. And so our brother St. Paul, who is in prison, can now write to these Ephesians. And a second thing that he says here, he says, "I beseech you, I beg you, I exhort you, I entreat you." And here again we see that things are not always what they seem. This is the Apostle Paul. He was called by Jesus Christ himself. You remember the road to Damascus. And that calling, that setting apart of Paul to be a prophet for God. He's been carried up to the third heaven. He writes the majority of the New Testament. If there was ever a spiritual authority, it is St. Paul. And yet, how does he relate to these Ephesian children of his? He says, "I beg you, I implore you to live a life worthy of the calling to which you have been called." And here's what's unique about that, is that the Apostle Paul does not use the power and authority that he has to force people to do things. But in his wisdom, he understands that he can beg of his very children so that they might do what? That they might freely choose that which is good. You see, this is the way that God so often works in our lives. And it's not as we might think it would be. Because what we see in this world so often is that those who have power, they use it for their own gains and for their own purposes. And they seek power so that they can do what? So that they can control. Now, don't get me wrong. I love to control situations. We all do. It's what we all long for, right? We hate being out of control. It makes us uncomfortable. And yet what the gospel calls us to is that when we have authority, when we have power, we don't use that in a worldly way, but we use it in such a way that those whom we are over actually are given power to freely choose the things that they ought to. And of course, if you have kids, you know the frustration of this. You want them to choose all of the right things, but you have to bear with them as they figure out how to do that. And of course, that takes us to the real definition of love, that we continue to bear with people, even as the apostle calls the Ephesians to do so, to forbear one another with patience. Things aren't always what they seem. This final aspect here is this, that he calls us to live according to the calling with which we have been called. What's the calling that you've received from God? Well, you can take a number of different identities or definitions of it. You've been called to be his child. You've been adopted as his son or daughter. And therefore, you are a child of the high king. You are royalty. This is the calling with which and to which you have been called. But how do you live that out? And here again, this is what the fairy tales teach us. That this great and high calling that we've received is called to be lived out in all lowliness and meekness, with patience, forbearing one another, even accepting the bond of peace. You see, St. Paul can take all of the things that the world despises, and we can forget this. We live in a culture that was previously shaped by gospel truth. We're losing that. But in the ancient world, it was all about me. It was all about my reputation. It was all about my glory. It was about power and control and pride and honor. And yet the apostle calls us to something different. He recognizes that we have this great and high calling, yet we live it out through lowliness and meekness and patience. Why do we do this? Because Jesus Christ has turned everything on its head. Because the one who was the King of all came to us and he became the servant of all. The one who was above all came to us and he willingly and voluntarily submitted himself beneath all. Because the one who was rich beyond measure willingly gave up all of those riches and became impoverished for our sake. And this is now what is glorious. This is what is glorious in the eyes of God. And this is what he calls us to, and this is how he works in the world. And so, brothers and sisters, this morning, perhaps you face circumstances that are outside of your control. Perhaps you face circumstances that are not what you want. Perhaps there are relationships in your life that cause you great pain. Perhaps there are places of suffering, areas of suffering that you are called to endure. Well, this morning I want you to remind yourself that things are not always what they seem. And if you have the opportunity to voluntarily submit yourself to Christ and to serve those around you, that this is the means by which God will bring about your salvation and perhaps the salvation of those around you. Let me leave you with this final story of our precious saint this morning. He is known as a stylite. That is, he's one of those who lived on a column, on a pole. For 53 years, he lived this way. So at some time in the 600s, Aleppios, he is called to build a church. In fact, Saint Euphemia appears to him and tells him to go and build a church in a particular area. And so he goes there and he manages to raise the funds, to find the support, and to build this church. And soon after he builds this church, he sets up this pole that he lives on. And the church that he builds it on top of a pagan temple. And there's also a pagan graveyard there. And so for all of this time, he stays upon this pole, and at the nighttime, he is pelted by demons. They throw rocks and they throw stones at him. And eventually, he even takes off the roof of his shelter so that he can again willingly endure the winds and the rains, so that he can suffer for the sake of Christ. And after these many years, what does his suffering result in? Well, number one, he drives out the demons in that region. The demons flee before this man's submission to Jesus Christ. And it still boggles my mind, his willingness to suffer. Folks, there is something about this. I keep trying to find a way around it, but I can't. I see it in the Scriptures and I see it among the saints, this willingness to subject themselves to suffering, all for the sake of Christ. Well, at the end of his life, what is left? There is the church that he plants, and then on either side of him, there is a monastery for men and a monastery for women. And brothers and sisters, it boggles my mind, but it encourages me over and over again to see that the suffering of Christ's saints is never in vain. You're never alone in your suffering. But our God, who called forth all things out of nothing, even out of the darkness and the void of your suffering, of what it may feel like, He can bring forth light. And He can bring forth life. And so this morning, brothers and sisters, I want you to remember. I want you to remember Paul's exhortation to the Ephesians. I want you to remember St. Aleppios. And I'm going to forget it, but I also want you to remember this rich young man. This rich young man who had all of the riches, and yet what do we see that happens to him? He's the one who goes away sad. And so if you're tempted to think, like the world does, that riches are everything, that your present circumstances and your present situations are all there is, remember once again that things are not always as they seem. But because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, there is something good at work, even in the midst of your sufferings, even in the midst of your trials, even in the midst of your temptations, if you will continue to look to Jesus Christ. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you so much for watching. I pray this was a blessing to you. If it is a blessing to you, please don't forget to like and subscribe and share these videos. It really does help us a great deal. Speaking of helping us, if you'd like to support this media outreach, go to our Patreon site at Faith Encouraged on patreon.com. You can also visit us at our website at faithencouraged.org and write me at frbarnabas@faithencouraged.org. I look forward to seeing you next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe. God bless you.